USAID adaptation community, and to thank John and all of you for coming despite the rain today. And what I want to do is present for 30 minutes, 40 minutes on a project that I'm doing. This is part of a bigger project, which is actually, I should mention, funded by the National Science Foundation. And I have a co-author on this work. Her name is Karleen Jones-West. She's a SUNY Geneseo. Tell you. But I'm here excited to talk to you about questions explicitly relating to climate change and attitudes towards climate change held in particular by some of the indigenous communities in the Amazon area in Ecuador, where we conducted part of the survey that was done in 2014. This was a national survey with an oversample in the Andean and the Amazon regions of the country to try and get a sense of how indigenous people in particular viewed climate change. The bigger project is to look at environmental change more broadly, with climate change being a subset of that. I would be glad to also speak to the broader findings, but as this is the adaptation community, I had to adapt my presentation, and so I'm speaking to the more specific today. The general findings on environmental attitudes more broadly are a little further developed as we're writing up a book and some articles, but we'll go with this. This is what we've got today. All right. So there's a puzzle here. In the U.S., climate change and religion seem to be wound together, and it seems, in fact, that there is something of a contradiction, at least in the popular press, and if you sort of think about stylized stories of who opposes for example, that it is people who believe very literally in some of the statements in some of the works. Okay? So there is a strong association made to that effect. The question is, if there is an opposition, thanks. A lot of mics today. So this one is the good one? Okay. So if there's an opposition between those who believe in climate change and those who don't, the association in the U.S. is often made between sort of religious fundamentalists versus, say, more sort of lay people or agnostics or non-believers, or it is often taken to that dimension, to the dimension of religion. What religion are you? And also religiosity. How deeply do you believe? Or how often or do you demonstrate your beliefs? With what regularity? So the question is, does that, first of all, I mean, there is a literature refuting that in the US, but mostly confirming it for, again, biblical literalists, who are the ones who believe literally in the direct word of biblical texts in some branches of Christianity. And so there is a positive correlation with non-belief in climate change with people who strongly uphold some of those beliefs. Okay, this is demonstrated. We could talk about some of the surveys from which this information was gleaned. I'm going to go on because the expertise that I have developed along with my co-author is really with regard to sort of other places. That is, if this is true in the U.S., how do other religions view climate change? Does this pattern hold up in other parts of the world? So I should say here that the broader project that we're looking at is to try and understand the relationship between vulnerability to changes in climate and people's degree of advocacy for environmental change or for conserving the environment in a broad sense. We can talk about what that means more specifically, but people who are in more vulnerable conditions in this Ecuadorian sample were the ones who were more likely to have strong attitudes about the environment. However, we also found some exceptions. As we surveyed throughout Ecuador, the eastern portion of Ecuador, I can skip ahead to, yes, let's skip ahead. Okay, so the Amazonian portion of Ecuador was found to have a different set of attitudes in the north, in the central portion, and in the south. And what caused these changes? We believe, after doing focus groups, contracting with the largest or most professional survey company in the social sciences in Quito, and then doing over 100 interviews after that around the country, we believe that people who answered the survey in areas which had already been exploited for oil, in the north in particular, were less optimistic and had weaker positions about the environment, weaker attitudes. People in the center, where the current negotiations are going on about oil extraction, had very strong attitudes. And in fact, people in the southern part of Ecuador, where most of the oil has not yet been extracted, had in fact the strongest positions of all. So the broader thesis of our work seems to be that where you are on the extractive frontier determines how strongly you're willing to advocate for environmental change. And the reason I think that people in the north really don't advocate strongly is because, frankly, a lot of that area has been degraded. You've heard of the Chevron case, right? There's oil spills everywhere. You can take what's called the toxic tour. I encourage you to go and take it. And you can see oil spills, in fact, that were quantified as being double the size, volume of the Exxon Valdez. Okay, so there's been a lot of degradation and a lot of poor management of cleanup, which I think leads people to a more fatalistic position. And this breaks out in accordance also, we expected, with which indigenous group you are part of, right? That's a thesis that is in the literature. But that did not turn out to be true. In other words, we found that regardless of which indigenous group you pertain to, you have a less positive view of environmental change if you're in the north, a more positive view in the middle, and a still more positive view than that in the south. Okay? So against that backdrop, we wanted to ask about people's views on climate change. And I guess just one more thing to say is that the bigger project seeks to compare the indigenous views of the Andean peoples, the Sierra, the mountain groups, the groups that are known more broadly for mobilization and activism, the groups that in fact have organized as part, or at least allies of the Ecuadorian state for some decades now, and who helped in fact overturn a couple of presidents at the turn of the 21st century, who have been very powerful in terms of mobilizational capacity, who have been accused lately of being co-opted by the government, okay? In the Amazon region, the indigenous communities are said to be much more diffuse, much less populous, much more independent and autonomous of the state. They have not achieved the kind of mobilizational capacity of those in the central Andean region, but our broad argument is using some of the legal cases that have been presented at the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, for example, and the Chevron case. The Inter-American Human Rights case was one that was won by the people of Sarayaku, as their rights to prior consultation had not been respected by the Argentine oil interests that were seeking to extract there, and by the Ecuadorian government. Hence, they won a settlement, a monetary settlement, and the ability to control what was going to happen in their district, and they have not opted to have oil drilling as of this time. Okay, so what we found is that new approaches to social movements using legal and more technical scientific approaches have been successful in this area, whereas this area has more of a traditional strength in numbers approach to mobilization. So we are really studying attitudes about the environment and the types of mobilizations that occur based on where you're located, sort of what your history is, and in general, sort of how these different groups have different objectives vis-a-vis mobilizing against the state, against the national government. Okay, so against that backdrop, and in a broad survey seeking to address those kinds of questions, we asked a good deal about climate change. All right, so with regard to the questions on climate change, the question is whether science versus religion, that dichotomy that we see a lot in the West, whether that holds up in Ecuador. And in fact, a lot of the indigenous communities, and especially those in the Quechua tradition, believe in a separate cosmovision where nature is at the center of their belief system rather than humans being at the center of the belief system. And so it might seem perhaps that scientific explanations of climate change might be antithetical to that belief system. At least that might be what one would think, reading what, for example, some of the older anthropological visits to that area and discussions of some of the cosmovision. There's several terms in Quechua that some of you have heard of, I'm sure. The Pachamama, the Mother Earth, has become enshrined in and given rights in the 2008 Ecuadorian Constitution. Elsewhere in the Andean region, in Bolivia, where Quechua is the language of many of the indigenous peoples, some of these rights are also codified and made into national laws. So if nature has rights, what does that say about science in the Western positivist sense? If those rights of nature are at the center of a belief system that is really focused on nature and the fluidity of nature, does that allow for views by Western science of technological measurements that are just at one particular snapshot cross-sectional moment? Because there's a big belief in temporality, and in fact temporality is not even linear in some views of some of the Andean people. And so the question is, how can Western science purport to make statements that would have application to that worldview? And in fact, regardless of the ontological questions, the questions about the nature of knowledge and how it might be different, people in the Amazon and Andean regions, and especially the indigenous people whose worldviews we asked about, they believe in climate change. Part of it is simply empirical. They have seen snow caps melting. They have seen the disappearance of river otters and other fauna that tend to be prevalent or have been prevalent in their areas where they live. They have more sunburns, there's more flooding. So people answered questions about those empirical phenomena related to climate change affirmatively, but then they went one step further, and when we asked abstractly, have you heard about climate change? Do you believe in climate change? Many of them did. And so then the question was, do people with different worldviews, with this indigenous, basically Quechua belief, although we interviewed in 6 or 8 languages and we have a whole range of indigenous communities, they do, when interviewed, share cosmovision beliefs in the general sense. In other words, we were able to generalize about this sort of indigenous cosmovision, and we were able to I mean, we lumped together some of the different indigenous communities. When people identified as having an indigenous religion, we were able to discern from that a pattern of behavior that was different from the Catholics, who constituted about 75% of the sample, and the evangelicals, who constituted about 15% of the sample. The indigenous community was much smaller, but there were enough people who identified as indigenous for us to be able to get some statistical significance. All right, so in general, we have a lot of literature in the US about religion and belief in climate change. There isn't a lot outside of the US. So it seems that, you know, there's a lot of rhetoric by the Amazon indigenous people and their leaders especially about stewardship of the land. And so the question was, for us, does this rhetoric, which is really very frequent, anyone who's been to some of the international climate change negotiations has seen a lot of this, right? Which is where people take positions very much referencing their ability to serve as stewards, the best guardians of nature. And the indigenous communities are very naturally well positioned to do that, and they do. But then the question is, what do the rank and file think? Is this rhetoric for negotiations at the international level, or is this also what people truly believe? Okay, so we chose to do this study in Ecuador in part because there's been a lot of discussion of climate change issues in Ecuador at all levels. There was a debate for at least 5 years to try to get donations from the international community by the Ecuadorian government in order to not drill for oil in the SUNY Biosphere National Park, one of the most biodiverse areas of the Amazon rainforest. That effort was suspended in 2013, but only after a lot of publicity. So that is one reason why it would be good to conduct a survey in that country where more people have been exposed to the subject. All right. There also, of course, as we all know in the adaptation community, a lot of discussion about equity and about who should contribute how much to the effort to reduce emissions and how to the adaptation funds. And this in Ecuador has been highly pronounced. The new government, well, not so new anymore, but the President Correa has been very strong in advocating on sort of the south side of this, making arguments about equity for the south, for the global south. And so this also contributes to publicity on these issues. And there's a big debate domestically because while the country has on paper a very progressive environmental policy, as I highlighted, the Constitution itself grants rights to nature, and that is the first time ever that that has happened, or at least in recent history, and I think frankly may be hard to implement, and I guess some of you may be able to comment on that, but those do exist. At the same time, all of the country's discretionary budget and social welfare improvements, which are dramatic over the last several years, are funded by royalties from extraction. In other words, oil money pays the rent, and it pays for the government to be popular and make rhetorical statements about environmentalism. So there's something of a contradiction domestically, which we really were able to tap into over environment versus development, okay? Furthermore, Ecuador does have a large indigenous population, which we were able to oversample with several hundred Amazon area indigenous respondents to the survey, several hundred Andean region respondents, and so and Ecuador has a lot of ecosystems within a relatively small geographic area, making it also a very good study. All right, so a few words about sort of the summa causae, which is the statement about the indigenous cosmovision, the the fluid and relational concept which creates a bond between humans, also nature and also spirituality, and is responsible for maintaining those bonds. Okay, so this is the concept of the indigenous cosmovision, and it is one where there is a fluid relationship between humans and nature is at the center of things. It's conveyed often in the social science literature in the West as a primordialist position. For those of you who have studied anthropology, it is somewhat, although there's a relative range also in how people perceive this cosmovision. Some people are very sort of hardcore and that this is a core belief, and some people believe that they can meld and integrate and assimilate their traditional beliefs with Western science, and they don't see any problem or contradiction whatsoever. In fact, that seems increasingly to be the case. All right, and so that was what we were trying to test. So several hypotheses. One is that, if you have a support for an indigenous religious cosmovision, this will increase your propensity to believe in climate change. Actually, this is kind of counter to what you might expect from some of the sort of anthropological literature, but this is how we phrased the hypothesis. Another one was based on Western science, which is that if you support the scientific method and sort of Western science, then that is expected to increase your propensity to believe in climate change. Okay? We can talk more about the sample a little bit later. I think you might want, I'm going to let it go except to say that we had a sample size of about 1,780 people, which was a good sample size for a nation of about 15 million, national sample, all over the country except Galapagos, with an oversample again of the indigenous communities, both in the Amazon, where we did about 650, and in the Andes, where we did about 450. Okay, so we did the national sample, and then we did boosters of indigenous communities in addition to the national sample. All right, so these were the variables. This was what we were testing. This is, the question was, does climate change exist, yes or no? And how important is the topic of climate change to you personally? Not at all important or very important. There was a wide range of responses. So these were the proxies for whether people believe in climate change and how much. Okay, and the questions are, again, does a strong belief in sort of Western science approaches affect your belief in climate change? And does a strong belief in the cosmovision, Sumak Kausai, the Quechua tradition of nature, does that strongly impact your belief in climate change? We had some other variables that we included. I'm sorry, this slide is a little garbled as I transferred from one version of PowerPoint to the next, but I think the bottom line here is questions about the construction of how do we measure cosmovision, right? How do we measure whether people have a strong belief in traditional indigenous religion? One of the questions was, Mother Earth deals with problems such as shortages in water and food. Yes or no? Cosmovision and spirituality are more important than science, juxtaposing those together. And the indigenous people are more connected with Mother Earth than the non-indigenous people. Okay, so that was several questions that we put together that fit well together statistically that we used as the indicator of cosmovision. Okay, then we had one for science, which is questions, science and technology are making our lives healthier, yes or no? Science and technology are making our lives more comfortable, yes, no? Because of science and technology, the next generation will have more opportunities, yes, no? Agricultural techniques taught by scientists are better than traditional ones, yes, no? Indigenous groups should work with national and or foreign scientists to resolve local problems. So those were the questions that we combined to construct support or not for Western science and technology, okay? We had a bunch of other variables that we put in that we can discuss. I think I'm going to go to the punchline, which is to say that, that in fact, we tested not only we also tested religion. What religion are you? And again, we have Catholic, evangelical, and sort of indigenous cosmovision. And we also tested religiosity. How religious are you? How often do you practice your religion? On a daily basis, on a weekly basis, less often than that. And so what we found, in fact, is that the effect of an indigenous cosmovision has an impact in the positive direction on your belief in climate change. That is to say, if you state that you believe in indigenous religion and you believe strongly in that, the more strongly you believe, the more likely you are to believe in climate change. Okay? And this was counter to what we found for the evangelicals. Evangelical beliefs, being evangelical makes you 15% more likely to believe in climate change, but that is only if you are not observant. If you are observant, then the more observant you are, the less likely you are to believe in climate change. The Catholic majority of the survey respondents did not assemble as strong a pattern as these other two groups. So they sort of fell in the middle. Okay, they were not a strong pattern, but the indigenous religious and the evangelicals both had strong patterned behaviors that we could identify. Okay, so what do we conclude from this? We concluded that it seems that Western science and religion are not incompatible. The tension between science and religion in the US public opinion, I mean, we may have overgeneralized as we probably should not have, but at least in the Ecuadorian case where we did our research, this tension does not seem to exist. Whether an individual believes in climate change depends both on their religious beliefs and religiosity, which is to say how strongly they exercise those beliefs, how regularly they exercise them. Okay. Furthermore, indigenous cosmovision is found to be consistent with belief in climate change, as is the Catholic view, although it was not as pronounced. And more literalist evangelical respondents tended to believe in climate change less as their religiosity levels increased, okay? And I think the other conclusion to be drawn is that the stewardship claim that is often made by indigenous leaders has perhaps some validity if we look at religion anyway as an indication. That is, that the rank and file, the survey respondents, rather than just the leaders, tended to share beliefs about the importance of climate change, the more religious they were. So if they expressed greater degrees of religiosity, their belief in climate change increased, and so it seems that would make them natural advocates for issues that are of interest to this group. So I think that there is some confirmation from this study that some of the sort of traditional beliefs do have strong connection to empirical information, which may be what people observe on the ground, what their practices of life are day to day, rather than what they get from testing pH levels in their streams. But nonetheless, they draw the same conclusions about climate change from those. So I think that's important for us to consider as people working on adaptation around the world look for good allies in that struggle. Okay, so I'll leave it there and address questions about the climate change perhaps if you have other broader questions. Thank you. Yes, or do you want to, should I field my?
Yeah, just field them. It's just for the online audience, we'll have.
Thank you very much. That's a very interesting study that you've done. I was curious because at the beginning of your talk, you talked about the fact that where there's more environmental degradation, there's sort of less, I don't know, less positive thinking. I wasn't clear what you meant by that. Is it less belief in climate change? How that relates to the climate change aspect? Yeah. And then how you tease that out from the religiosity part of it. Like if you take that out, the degradation part, does the religiosity still stand, I guess?
Okay. All right, should I take them one by one?
Sure, yeah.
All right,
I think that'll work better.
So that's a good question. So we haven't done, I mean, this is everyone's response when they haven't done the statistical analysis on that particular question. Academics, we hate to speculate. However, so we haven't done the exact analysis of using climate change as the variable on one side of the equation and on the other side sort of environmental attitudes. However, we did use position on the extractive frontier, that is on the map that I showed. You know, where you're located in this area dictates not only the level of degradation that your environment has experienced, but does it determine how you feel about climate change? We do have information on that, and that is statistically significant, which means that yes, you are more likely to have beliefs about climate change that are positive. It is consistent that in this area you have a stronger belief in climate change. In this area you have a less. So it is consistent with the broader argument. Yes, it is. Thanks for that.
For the Cosmovision respondents, they had a strong belief. Were you able to tell if they had an understanding of what was driving climate change? Could you use it to motivate not just on the adaptation side, but on the mitigation side?
You know, that's another good question. We assembled an index of a bunch of empirical questions, some of which had responses we could pattern individually, but as a group we could not. So we don't know what to make of that. That is to say, individually people say, yes, there's more sunburn, there's more, people say that the food makes me sick more often. People say, you know, that there's more flooding, thanks, and that, you know, animals, flora and fauna are less prevalent than they used to be in certain areas. But we could not get a composite measure out of that was significant. So we have to try again and figure out what that means. So but individually, those questions they are important.
I got in late, but so would you imagine that these results apply to indigenous people everywhere, or in just this context? Would you be really misguided in trying to extrapolate these results beyond Ecuador here?
I think, and this relates to John's question, I think there is a relationship between what people sense empirically and what they believe about climate change, and that it's not just loaded on their religious beliefs, but I can't prove that at this time, and I can't therefore generalize. I mean, we would like to, I mean, we're always considering the next grant proposal to try and find another country where you would, that has some extensive differences in religion where we could test this next. We don't have that yet. So I can't answer definitively, but I do think that people's attitudes are based on their empirical experience as well as their religious beliefs, and I think we need to find a way to show that. I guess that doesn't answer your question fully. I guess the only answer I can offer is that we don't have enough to generalize beyond this country, but we do have enough to generalize across regions in this country and to some different groups, and also, we can talk about suburbanites in Quito versus Amazon indigenous people. So within this country, we can speak about generalization, but we can't go beyond that at this time. And I'm sorry, just to add to that, there are not a lot of international surveys. There's a lot of surveys, that talk. There's the World Values Survey. There's, in the social sciences, a range of surveys on people's political beliefs about a range of topics. But climate change, although it has been addressed in a relative few Pew surveys that are across nations, there have not been a lot of sufficient number of studies. And so this is an area where we need a lot of work in general. So.
I'm going to ask a question from someone online, and then I'll go to the so we'll get this one first.
Sure.
So Jim Tarrant, he asked the question, is there a possibility that American strong belief in individualism and personal agency, and also the belief in mastery over nature from evangelicals, partly explain the difference between American and some developing country cultures?
I guess that is possible. Some of the questions that we asked about attitudes relating to indigenous religion had to do with collective views of the world versus individual views. If that questioner is right, then your question about religiosity around the world becomes more of one traditions of sort of the U.S. stereotype, the rugged individualism, right? In which case that might lend itself to generalization. But at this time we can't make that leap, although I would think that it is suggested, but I'm stuck with the data that I have.
The microphone's really on.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for your presentation. And I know that this is a shorter version of a larger project, so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more of how you're taking into account just ontological differences between how, religion and whether religion and cosmovision can really be equated on the same plane, and by extension, really thinking about how indigenous people think of science and technology much more differently in the way that we think about it in Western science. So I'm wondering if you kind of think about those ontological questions, and maybe, I know you consulted earlier anthropological literature, but I'm wondering if you're kind of looking into what's going on more in contemporary literature with those kind of questions of ontology.
Okay. So the question of ontology is sort of how knowledge is formed and sort of different people's views about how knowledge is formed are issues that were a little more abstract than we could fully deal with. I mean, what we did is we parted from the assumption that these terms and this general discussion about the centrality of nature and the fluidity of the system around us, which was frankly not nailed down all that well definitionally, but was nonetheless mentioned literally dozens of times by the president in his political campaigns. We took that as our starting point. In other words, we decided that we could not talk about knowledge and the origins and what knowledge comes first in the sort of people's conceptualization of their religious framework. We don't have the background, but So what we did is we said, okay, this is a policy question, and we're just going to start from that premise, which is to say, people's stated beliefs in a general sense, do they affect their policy beliefs? So that was really all we did. I mean, someone needs to do. You're a graduate student, you said, right? So are you looking at that, or what?
Yeah, actually, when I looked at the title,
Where? Oh, yeah.
conservation, which I guess is a little bit different but also connected to climate change. And what I look at is the Western conception of science and technology and ontological differences with that, but more connecting it to international politics, conservation, territory. So it's like one big
Wow.
crazy mess. But I look at science and technology too.
So are your findings in Brazil consistent with these?
I would say that they speak to each other because they don't really, the territory that I work with is completely protected, and it's one of the few protected areas in South America. So there isn't really too much empirical evidence or they say, right, about climate change, but they're more focused on keeping, hydroelectric dams out and gold mining, and it's more anti-extractivist, conservation-leaning than necessarily climate change, but they're very much all on that same international spectrum that, the people from Sarayaku are from too. So that's kind of what I attempt to look at too, is more of the cosmovisions. I'm looking at that all the time.
No,
That's why I brought the question.
More how you define it and how you deal with that question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd love to
Because-
talk to you more when we
Okay.
get a chance. Yeah,
that'd
thank
be
you.
great.
Thank
So we need to. Well, I don't know if we have the space to backtrack and look at those broader questions, but we at least need to have some statement about them, which we do not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd love to talk to you. Thank you.
Thanks for the great talk. A follow-up question to the previous one, and then piggybacking a second on there. Specifically, this is not about ontology, but about religious identity. In your instrument, is it possible to be both indigenous and Catholic, for instance? In other words,
Yes.
can you maybe disaggregate how that would show up a little bit? And then
Yes.
expanding on that, I'm also curious, you mentioned but then didn't show a graph that religiosity, intensity of Catholicism tended to trend positively on climate change views, and I'd be interested in hearing a little bit about that as well. Thanks.
Okay, good. So we did measure, we had several measures of indigeneity, if you will, sort of self-identification, as well as whether you speak a language, okay? And then we have measures of religion that are separate from that. So we cross those and we could get that information. So there is a strong overlap between speakers of indigenous languages and cosmovision indigenous religions. With regard to the sort of Catholicism's relation to belief in climate change, it is statistically significant it's not statistically significant, which is to say that there was not a strong pattern that we could develop as there was with the cosmovision believers and evangelical believers. So it doesn't make as much sense to draw that pattern. And we didn't work on a lot of analysis once we realized that it wasn't significant.
Yeah, and that would make sense. Just a clarification, in your 75, 15, 10 religious breakdown, the 75% includes people who both self-identify as indigenous and not, but then you're disaggregating their claims about religious identity?
Yes,
from
those are
cultural
just
or linguistic
Catholic.
identity?
Those are just Catholic, so it's just the religious identity.
Right.
It's what people say they are religiously.
But many of those people included in the 75% would be Quechua-speaking indigenous community members who are
Yes.
Catholic.
Yes. So
Got it.
we gave preference to claims about religious belief only. We have the other ones and we've tested them, but you make choices and then you second guess yourself. But the choice we made was just on religious self-identification.
Thanks for the presentation very interesting. And just to add to the conversation, Ingility manages a regional project called Initiative for Conservation of the Andean Amazon in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. We were in Bolivia before and in Brazil, but now we're down to 3 countries. We have some of the same goals as conserving or improving biodiversity conservation. And of course, in dealing with indigenous groups is one of the big factors. We help them a lot with doing their life plans. And the life plans gets into this vision and looks at when do you do hunting and fishing, and you do the kind of self-managing of resources. What I liked about your variables there, you've categorized degradation in the Amazon, degradation, less degradation, and not very much, and you've got different views on that. I also was interested in, if you look at the religions that have been there, you look at Catholicism, who was there a long time ago with the Jesuits and so forth, whereas evangelicals have been in there recently.
Yeah.
And so then is there any, and we've never, in our work, when we do the life plans with the indigenous groups, we never get into the religion because that's part of their whole life plan, part of the way they look at the world and the next world and so forth. So we've never identified them as or in evangelicals or Roman Catholic. So I'm just wondering, are we putting a label on these people that maybe don't really have a label? I don't know. I'm just asking that as a general question.
Yeah, I think you're right to some degree, because remember I told you that which indigenous group people pertain to or language they speak does not have an independent effect on their view of climate change. What has the effect is sort of where they are on the extractive frontier, which is sort of what you just summarized, the three areas. Part of the reason I think that with your ethnic identity does not have that relation is that, you know, in the survey you can't gather information about this, but when you go interview people in the Shuar region, you find great divisions. You find a confederation of the Shuar people who were sort of with the Catholic missionaries. Then you find a group, a confederation, sort of a union, if you will, or an agrarian group organized who the evangelicals sort of helped facilitate and create. Then you find independent ones which are having a rejection of those earlier movements. And so what you find is that divisions, frankly, occur between them on religious grounds. Now, we need more familiarity in order to better map those and how they fit. We're not likely going to know how we don't have a large, we have, maybe we had little groups of about 30, probably, I would have to check, but maybe 3 Shuar groups, maybe 90 respondents. We're not going to be able to get a lot of statistical significance and precision off of 90 respondents. So we're not going to be able to draw that fine distinction of what effect which religious affinity you are with has. And I think that gets to Evan's questions too. But I think that historically and sort of geopolitically or geo-religiously, if you will, we could at least start to get at that in the case studies. We're trying to. I think that has a big impact. The other question I would ask is that these plan de vida, these life plans that all of the indigenous communities do, to me those are really budgets. And so those prioritize spending from the outside, and what they do is dictate people's priorities. So that I think their religious beliefs or their belief in the role of nature and how important conservation is play very strongly into the construction of those, at least where we interviewed people in Ecuador. And in fact, there was a problem in Ecuador because there's an interesting dynamic where the government is supposed to give, I believe it's 10% of the royalties from extraction directly to the affected communities. The problem is that that spending becomes kind of populist spending. It becomes a dedication of a clinic, but not stocking it with drugs. It becomes a building or apartment buildings, urban-style apartment dwelling for indigenous people who don't want to live that way, rather than spending it more efficiently, right? So there's a lot of problems of national level spending imposing itself on localities where people don't really get to choose how they would spend those monies. And I'm kind of wondering how it is in Peru and Colombia, if there's a similar dynamic, because I think politically that is one of the most important issues. The question is, I can accept or not having oil extraction, and I can believe or not in damage that might eventually do to the climate in a very abstract way. I can believe that or not. I might be willing to make a trade-off. If I have a child who is sick and there's a possibility of a clinic, I could very well make that trade-off. But if I think the clinic is going to be shoddily delivered, then I'm less likely, right? I mean, those service delivery questions do come in at some point, and we're trying to figure out how to get our hands on that. So I think that's an important question that would also be relevant for the development community, and more particularly to ask you, if I may, afterwards, how this works in Colombia and Peru. All right. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your interesting, thoughtful presentation. Historically speaking, to what extent is your research benefiting from the findings of Alexander von Humboldt, who spent 200 years ago extensive time in a region? He documented all the fauna, the flora, the plight of the indigenous people, and so on. In Ecuador, for example, he tried to climb to summit of the mountain, Mount Chimborazo, which is, by the way, the closest mountain to the sun because it's located in Ecuador. It's only 6,500 meters, 6.5 kilometers. But anyway, could you say something in favor of Alexander von Humboldt?
Yeah, I mean, von Humboldt is more, to my knowledge at least, more of a naturalist than an anthropologist. So I've read his works in a cursory way in the past, but I can't say that we drew on his work, which I believe was in the 1700s, right? It was one of the first sort of very systematic explorers. I mean, he's likened to sort of de Tocqueville's work in the US, except that, to my view anyway, de Tocqueville took a much more of a social scientific approach about sort of studying people and making a lot of pretty gross generalizations about groups of people. Von Humboldt, I think, stuck more to nature and sort of to the sort of cataloging and identifying natural phenomena, unless I'm mistaken. But I have to say we didn't use it, for whatever that's worth.
Hi, I did my graduate research on, I was trying to remember the exact title, it was a couple years ago, climate change education strategies and a case of an indigenous network in the Amazon basin, and I was looking at Koika. Yeah, and I was curious, I'm really curious about your power and knowledge dimensions, and you had mentioned like the leaders versus the front line, and so I just was wondering if that played in at all, if you talked to the different sub-federations and networks like that.
Yeah, so we talked to Koika in Quito and saw them in Lima in action. They're a very interesting group. The heads of Koika, some of them are Shuar, and I think most of them are, at least the 2 or 3 that I spoke to in Ecuador, and they had a very sort of highly kind of Western view of this that they espoused about, the lungs of the earth and about red and about the need to sort of figure out how to make, sinks of carbon dioxide profitable, and so they're all about getting projects. So they're going to be at USAID. I know they've already been at USAID seeking funding, and they're looking all around. So I consider them to be much different from the people you interview, in Macas or in the areas of Shuar dominance in the Amazon region. I mean, they're a fascinating group, and they've all been all over the world, and they have a very, very pragmatic approach to all of this, right? They they will invoke the sort of traditional beliefs in arguing that they are better equipped to defend and to manage these programs than anyone else. But for them, it seemed, in part at least, that it was a matter of getting projects. And frankly, how am I to blame them? That's on the other hand, they are extremely Western in their approach, to my view. I don't know if that answers your.
It is a network, and so it's like all the federations aggregate up to this larger network in the entire Amazon basin. So yeah, that's what I focused on, was actually read and looking at all of that. But I was just curious about what you looked at, if anything, about knowledge and power between those different levels, like the hierarchical level.
So the broader, one of the big stories we're trying to get out of this is that the Sarayaku case and the Chevron case, to some extent, are these kind of new forms of knowledge-based social movements. They're not that new. I mean, others have written about them since the 80s. I think social scientists have been talking about this at the international basis. I mean, the rubber tappers in Brazil were an example of people who took their plight to the IDB, Chico Mendes, the Chico Mendes story, all of the networks and the alliances between national and international environmentalists in the Amazon going back to that period, I think, are embodied in part by the Sarayaku legal case. And so we're talking about the knowledge basis of the Sarayakus and also people like those at Koika, compared to the more traditional approach to politics and social movements, which is this, strength in numbers, right? We mobilize people, and while I was doing field work in Ecuador, Ecuanare, which is the long-standing Andean indigenous group in the south in particular, was mobilizing because there's mining going on, which is using water, which people need for farming and ranching, and it's polluting their water. But they take a much more traditional approach because they have a much larger population. They have concentration in areas in the urban corridor of the country in the middle, and they have strong relations to the government traditionally, right? In the Amazon area, it's very diffuse, very different. So it's a different kind of social movement, and that's sort of what we're studying, and I think Koika fits well into that. So I think I would love to, if you have a master's thesis or a doctoral thesis, or that it's out. All right, I would like that. I don't know enough about Koika.
So from your research, were you able to conclude at all that the people who believed more in climate change were more willing or already adapting to climate change? And so would it be more likely to come in with, for example, for agriculture, if you came in with new techniques, would those people be more willing to adapt in indigenous communities where they might have been doing the same things for centuries?
I think so, and I hope so. I mean, I can't say, as we haven't asked them about projects that have already been undertaken, but rather we had to ask general questions in order to accommodate people all over the country. I can say, I think with certainty, that it would seem that people would have that energy and enthusiasm, but I can't say that they've expressed it concretely, unfortunately. I mean, that's the problem with surveys. I mean, I do survey research, but I also try and do other forms of research. The problem with survey research is that you're just getting, what people say they feel about something. You're not getting what they actually do. So I think part of the next step in survey research is to interview people who've actually done something and survey them, right? And that's kind of what you're asking for.
Yeah.
Just a quick question for me on your survey design. How did you choose the phrase climate change over global warming?
Yes, we focus groups.
And following up on that, when you were doing your interviews, did you have to distinguish or define that for the person you were interviewing?
Yeah, we did 10 or 12 focus groups, and at least one in each of the regions where we were going to do the survey. And so we asked at each of the focus groups whether people, a couple of things. One, had they heard of climate change and they heard of global warming, and which one was more kind of a charged term? Which one had a stronger kind of connotation from the get-go? In other words, we wanted a more kind of neutral term. We settled on climate change because that seemed, as it has been elsewhere, to be the more contemporary phrasing, although some people did reference, global warming, in which case we just nodded. I mean, the idea of the survey was to accept global warming, but all of the phrasing was as climate change. If the respondent said, you mean global warming, then the surveyor would say yes. So that was the prompt, but climate change became the official, but it was a debate because it is in much of the region a debate.
In the US, there's an argument that because the oil industry is very influential at the national level, that carries down to the local level through challenging of Western science. You mentioned that in Ecuador, there's also an influence of the oil industry at that national level. Has that carried down in a similar way, and have you found a way to measure it?
I don't think it's carried down in a similar way. I think that in the US, what we see is the oil industry lobbying and kind of muddying the waters of scientists who have strong views about the existence of climate change. You can always get the occasional opponent to that to release a public statement, right? So we've had documentaries and books about this battle over the science, even though like 99% of the scientists agree that there is climate change. In Ecuador, there I don't think is such a scientific community large enough to make that a discussion. And at the formal level, we weren't testing whether people had heard about this from the media. We were testing what they knew empirically, what we were asking them. But I don't think that there is a debate about it in the national. I think everyone pretty much accepts it. I don't know of a debate in many other parts of the world. I don't know, maybe some of you have more experience than some of the rest of, that's a US phenomenon.
We have one more question, okay.
Yes, hello. I was wondering regarding the survey, if your respondents received any kind of specific benefit as a result of participating in the survey, or the group, or the region. I'm thinking an agenda for Eastern European countries and how projects have come out of those consensus groups.
Yes, that's also a good question, and it's always a good question when you're doing a survey because people are willing to participate in surveys, but there's a cost in terms of their time. This was an hour-long survey that we did. This raises a question of if you should provide something for them or not. At the end, we asked the company, which was familiar, which has done a lot of government surveys all over the country. It was the best survey company for penetrating very rural areas. Most of the survey companies were doing sort of deodorants and toothpaste, but this one had done sort of performance of government services and whether those reached outlying areas. They suggested that giving people a little something would be beneficial. So what did we settle on? We settled on giving them a recyclable shopping bag. A bag you could carry things in, but we didn't have, it wasn't about projects, it was about getting information. But if people would spend an hour answering, there was a bag, just the kind of recyclable bag, but it is practical. We wanted to give, and the survey company was happy. They put their logo on it, and that, their logos all over rural Ecuador. But I don't think there's a great answer to that to that question because there are differing views. Some say that if you give some people something, you're biasing their responses, and you're making it not about what they think, but about getting something, and that you may be biasing and sort of creating a different dynamic for the survey. But I don't think that happened overtly in the ones that, but it could have. So that's the way it is.
Okay, thank you again, Todd. Let's all.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. If you didn't get your name on the sign-up sheet, please sign up, and that will get you on the mailing list for this. We do this every month. Next month, I cannot remember who's speaking, but I do know that Tony Sochi from EPA is speaking in July about the Durban Adaptation Charter, and more generally about adaptation in urban environments, correct? Now you are.
Can I just add also that there's a paper that I can send if you're on the list, if people want it.
Yeah, so Todd said he would send the paper and as well as the presentation to Lily, and then she can distribute it to the whole list. If you don't want it, just rather than trying to get your name off the list. And so you'll have to check the email for where we will be in June, whether we're here or at the Mayflower Hotel, and for who the speaker is. We do have one, I just can't remember right now. Thank you very much. Thanks to Agility for putting this together, and we will see you in June.